Rumpelstiltskin. Long ago, when the world was different, people, animals, dwarves, and countless fairy tale characters lived in harmony with each other. From stories and legends, fairy tales emerged, meant to endure the test of time. On the outskirts of a remote village stood an old mill, which belonged to the miller and his pretty daughter. The miller was indeed a hard-working man, but he was also talkative and loved to brag. His daughter, on the other hand, was reservedly clever and capable. She had made clever adjustments to improve the mill, and indeed had a golden touch to the daily work. Often she had kept her father in check. One day it happened that the miller took his goods to the castle of the local king. The kingdom was ruled by a greedy man. The old king lived with his only son in the manorial estate and ruled strictly over his subjects. But the troubles of his time also burdened the old king. The last years brought famine and unrest, and the income from the village almost came to a complete standstill. As the miller went about his business with the cook, he began his boasting as usual. He loudly told about the good yield and his daughter, who was not only pretty, but also had magic fingers. He would owe his wealth to the young thing. The king, who just came out of the dining room and overheard the conversation, became attentive. The miller continued to boast. His daughter could even turn straw into gold. Grumpy, but also curious, the old king turned to the miller and asked him to bring the girl to the castle. Of course, the miller was not comfortable with this. He knew about his boastfulness, just like his daughter. But to defy the king's order would be impossible. As soon as she arrived, the girl was led to the highest tower in the castle and locked up. In the room, there was a spinning wheel and several bundles of straw. The king ordered the young woman to get to work. There the poor miller's daughter sat and did not know what to do. If she did not spin straw into gold, the king would have her and her father executed. In her despair, the girl began to weep bitterly. Her tears dripped on the ground, and outside the sun was slowly setting. At the last ray of sunlight, she heard the door open with a creak. An eerie figure with red hair and a fiery gaze entered the chamber. It was a gnome. Despite his frightening appearance, he asked almost calmly what was wrong and why she was crying. The girl sobbed and told the gnome about her impossible task. The gnome sat down with the girl and told her that he could do the task for her, but not for free. His help would always have a price. In despair, the young girl looked down at herself and saw the necklace on her neck. Without further ado, she offered it to the gnome as payment. Greedily, the gnome grabbed the necklace and slid onto the spinning wheel. As if by magic, the gnome actually began to spin straw into gold. One bobbin after another filled with real gold. For a while the girl watched the spectacle spellbound, until she tiredly fell asleep on the floor. At sunrise, the girl woke up to the sound of the door creaking again. This time, however, it was the old king who could not believe his eyes. It was unbelievable. The room was filled with golden coils. At the sight of the gold, the king was gripped by sheer greed. Was this peasant girl really going to be the solution to his problems? So he brought the girl into the cellar of the castle. The room in which she was now locked up was even larger than the tower room. There was also more straw brought in. Again, the king ordered her to turn all straw into gold. With a loud bang, the door fell shut again, and the desperate young woman was left in the dark. Only a narrow window and a weak candlelight illuminated the room. Uncertain and anxious, the young miller's daughter sat down at the spindle. Hour after hour, she tried her luck, but it was in vain. No matter what she tried, she could not duplicate the miracle of the gnome. The last rays of sunlight flashed through the window, and the miller's daughter could no longer hold back and began to weep bitterly again. When the first tear touched the ground, the door opened again with a creak, and the red-haired gnome entered. The gnome looked around skeptically, but now also had a slight grin on his face. It seemed as if he knew the avarice and greed of the old king only too well. Finally, he sat down next to the girl and asked directly what she would give him for all the work. Wordlessly, the girl gave the gnome the ring from her finger. It was her most precious and only possession she still had. The gnome pushed the miller's daughter aside and began his magical work again. The whirring and humming of the spindle made the miller's daughter so tired again that she fell into a deep sleep. Only the creaking of the door woke her up again, and again the old king stood in the room. For a few moments he stood there silently with a greedy look. Finally, he instructed one of his servants to fetch his son. Then he turned to the two of them and said that she had to perform this miracle one last time. If she could do it, his son should take the miller's wife. She would then be a princess herself and would secure the wealth of the kingdom. Thereupon, the king had the gold cleared out of the chamber and loaded with straw up to the ceiling. The amount was considerable, and the girl became quite anxious. Was it possible to process this amount? She did not have long to ponder, however, and was once again locked in the room. Desperate and full of discomfort, the miller's daughter waited until the day was over. And with the last rays of the sun, a terrible realization came to her. She had nothing left to give the gnome. Panic arose, and she began to cry. As her tears touched the ground, the gnome entered the room, as he had all the days before. Once again, no words were needed. The gnome disdainfully walked past the piles of straw and sat down with the miller's daughter. She answered him directly that she had nothing more to give him. Nodding and with a grim grin, the gnome turned to her and pointed to a contract he had brought with him. She would owe him her firstborn child, which would come from her marriage to the prince. For a while, the young woman sat silently in front of the spinning wheel until she finally nodded quietly. The gnome, however, pointed to the contract, which she finally signed. Thereupon, the gnome did not let another second pass and began his work one last time. The wedding of the prince and the miller's daughter was the event of the kingdom. The wealth of the city and the castle would henceforth be known beyond all borders. From now on, everyone called it the Golden Castle. After spring, summer, autumn, and winter, the young queen finally gave birth to her child. It was a boy, and thus the future rightful ruler of the kingdom. And one warm evening, just as the queen was getting ready for bed, the door opened with a creak. The gnome entered abruptly with his fiery eyes, looking at mother and child. With a serious look, he approached the young woman and demanded that she now keep her word and give him the child. Desperately, she offered the gnome all the riches of the castle, but he refused superiorly. Something alive would be far more useful to him. The young woman began to cry again. She begged and pleaded with the gnome. She did this as sincerely as only a mother could for her children. The gnome looked at the young woman in her misery and now gave her a chance to keep her child. He then gave her 3 days to find out his true name. If she succeeded, she would be allowed to keep her child. If not, the child would go with him. Desperate for a way out, the young woman asked messengers and servants in the neighborhood for the name of the gnome. Due to the commotion in the castle, the old king finally heard the story about the gnome. He had guards posted around the prince's chambers and insisted on being present the next time the gnome visited. When the gnome finally returned, the first evening without ever being seen by a guard, the old king saw the gnome and turned white as a sheet. The gnome just looked angrily at the king, but walked wordlessly past him to the princess. The latter, however, had not yet received any feedback and had to guess at random. But neither Caspar, Melchior, nor Balthasar fit as names. Smugly, the gnome went away. The old king remained silent and still with fright, and retired to his chambers. On the second day, some messengers arrived and brought suggestions for names that were circulating. However, none matched the description of the gnome, but the young queen had no choice but to try these names. Once again, everyone gathered in the princess's chambers. The old king continued to look shocked and weak. Rippenbeest, Hammelswade, or Schnürbein were the names that were called this time. But again, without success. This time the gnome left the castle with a gloomy laugh that lingered for a long time. The old king felt weak and sickly. Nightmares plagued him that night. He knew the gnome. Once he himself had made an unpredictable deal with the creature. He also knew the name of the gnome, but he himself made a pact with the creature at the time. If he ever revealed his name, he would not live to see the next day. But he now also had the duty to protect his grandson. Torn between his feelings, the old king decided to write a note and give it to one of his messengers. They were to take the message to the princess immediately. It was already late, and the princess was sitting at her crib in tears when they brought her the message. It said that one of the messengers had seen a red-haired gnome in the forest, dancing around the fire and singing, "She is large and I am small, but oh, how I dance and prance round all. And though she's queen, how I will glean her only child as I'd foreseen, for she will never ever claim that Rumpelstiltskin is my name." "Rumpelstiltskin?" whispered the princess softly. Relieved but also worried about tomorrow, the princess went to bed. The next day, like all the others before, the gnome appeared again to the royal family, which had gathered in the throne room. His gaze was curiously and fixedly directed to the old king. Somberly, he gazed at the royal family and demanded that they now take their last chance to reveal his name. The princess asked if his name was Heinz or maybe Kunz. The latter, however, only shook his head and kept his gaze fixed on the old king. Then he looked at the young princess because he already suspected what was to come. "Is your name Rumpelstiltskin?" At that moment, a deafening scream went through the throne room. The red hair of the gnome turned into fiery flames that flickered upwards. "That's what the devil told you!" With these words, the gnome split into numerous flames that shot across the room and suddenly disappeared. There was an eerie silence. The gnome was gone. The old king gasped for breath and slumped. His son, the prince, wanted to support him on his throne, but it was too late. It was agreed. The excitement was too much for the old king. Peace and prosperity were now in store for the kingdom for a long time, and they lived happily ever after. But soon there should be a reunion.
By the way, with a subscription, you won't miss any of our fairy tales, and feel free to write us in the comments which fairy tale is your favorite.